The Iranian protests are a series of ongoing demonstrations and government crackdowns erupting nationwide in Iran since 2016. The protests with the intention of removing the Iranian government are often fueled by low wages, unemployment, inflation, government corruption, an ongoing water crisis, Persian nationalist fervor and the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The sequence of protests, which included the 2016 Cyrus the Great Revolt, 2017-2018 Iranian protests, 2018-2019 Iranian general strikes and protests, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 protests, 2019-2020 Iranian protests, 2020-2021 Iranian protests, met with violent responses by the Iranian authorities, including the killing of 1,500 protesters in November 2019 uprising and the violent crackdown on protests in Masha. Besides toppling the regime, the protest movement is aimed at poverty, issues and corruption in the economy, especially higher wages and pensions. The January 2020 protests were organized by bus drivers and taxi drivers in Tehran. Anti-regime protests were rising, with this chant, "Death to corrupt officials," heard the most. Seasonal workers in Mariwan participated in a strike movement as well, despite attacks by the security forces and intimidation meant to quell public protests that had begun on the 24th of January triggered by economic grievances. Kangan and Sanandaj experienced protests by oil workers and other sectors, with more than 5 blockades in protest for having not received any wages. Kaki saw protest rallies over water and fuel shortage crises sparking anger by their citizens for days. Employees in Masha's petrochemical factory protested non-payment of wages and inadequate responses to their demands. Islamabad Ghab saw railway workers protesting against not being paid for 5 months and the halting of their main construction project by the security forces. Hundreds of customers were regularly protesting in regular marches against the stock market and central bank crash in Tehran. Buildings in Isfahan were surrounded by hundreds of farmers, repeatedly rallying over poor conditions. Recent protests also took place in Khuzestan and Ahvaz and met with violent reactions from security forces. Locals staged rallies in Ahvaz and Gorgan, protesting imprisonments of protesters and demanding the President Hassan Rouhani to step down. In Khuzestan, bus drivers went on strike in protest to their low wages and the high price of spare parts for their buses. In late January and February, retirees and workers, employees and farmers, industrial workers and miners participated in protest rallies and marches, strikes, demonstrations, unrest, protest movement and general strike campaigns across Bandar-e-Langar in protest against long-delayed wages and insurances. Thousands of dock workers and municipality workers held various protests, protesting for higher salaries and longer insurances. Municipality workers in Alwan, who had not received their salaries for a long time, staged protest gatherings for weeks in January and February. In Khuzestan, contract workers protested unstable conditions and low salaries, while petrochemical workers of Apadana held gatherings, speeches, meetings and boycotts in companies. Factory workers in Hamadan protested non-implementation of early retirement. Retired workers in Shiraz and service workers rallied in Mashhad in protest against low wages and fake promises. Ahvaz and Golgan saw people gathering on the streets and creating roadblocks with tires and blockades for weeks, demonstrating against low wages and fake promises. In March 2020, amid the COVID-19 outbreak, Iran's prisons became overcrowded and rioting broke out in prisons in Tehran, Khorramshahr and Ahvaz, where 17 were wounded during protests by prisoners in the city against the fears of the spread of COVID-19 in Iranian prisons. Security forces reportedly fired gunshots in Khorramshahr and altogether 36 were feared dead during the prison riots nationwide. From the 9th to the 22nd of April, hunger strikes, demonstrations, protest marches, public unrest and protests erupted in Iran's prisons until July as well, protesting the outbreak of COVID-19 in prison. In response, the government released 85,000 prisoners. The rioting in Fars, Khorramshahr and Ahvaz on the 30th to the 31st of March was called for the release of prisoners and better conditions in prisons to combat the virus. It was the deadliest prison unrest in years. A wave of massive worker protests broke out across Iran when municipal workers and nurses participated in large gatherings against the COVID-19 impact on Iran. For weeks, gatherings, meetings, speeches, strikes and demonstrations occurred nationwide, with at least 2 cities experiencing major protests. In Khuzestan, medical staff organized large protest rallies in front of their offices, demanding wages and better conditions for hospitality workers, factory workers, coal miners, machine manufacturers and worker sectors have been among those